Ethan lived a simple life in the quiet town of Hawthorne. His days were filled with routines most people would consider mundane: cleaning, organizing, and taking care of the small but grand mansion of his employer, Mr. Vincent Hawkins. To the outside world, Ethan was nothing more than a housekeeper, a hard-working, unassuming man who carried out his duties with care and precision. Few people knew the true depth of his character or his past. He had long since abandoned the lavish, high-powered life he once knew. Now, he found solace in the simplicity of the work and the order it brought to his life. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything began to change. Ethan arrived at the Hawkins mansion before sunrise, as he always did. The mansion sat on a hill overlooking the town, an impressive structure with ivy-covered walls and manicured gardens. As he walked through the grand foyer, the soft echo of his footsteps reverberated off the marble floors. He started with the routine tasks: dusting the ancient furniture, polishing the silver, and preparing breakfast for his employer. It was always the same, a predictable pattern of chores that allowed him to keep his thoughts to himself. The life Ethan led now was a far cry from the one he had once known. He had been at the top of the corporate world, a young man with ambition, a sharp mind, and a reputation for making things happen. His career had been a whirlwind, the kind of fast-paced lifestyle most people only dreamed of. He worked in the finance sector, climbing the corporate ladder with ease, securing lucrative deals, and rubbing elbows with powerful people. At the time, he was living in a world of luxury: expensive cars, private jets, exclusive events. He had everything anyone could want, except peace. But peace was something he hadn't truly known in years. His rise to success had come with a price. As he climbed higher, his ethics and morals had started to blur. The pressure to succeed had taken a toll on his personal life, and the stress from work had driven him to places he didn't want to go. He had distanced himself from his family, burned bridges with old friends, and even lost himself in the process. The realization came one night, after another late meeting that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Ethan looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at him. That was the moment he decided to walk away from it all. The transition had been difficult, but it was necessary. He moved back to Hawthorne, the small town where he had grown up, far from the chaotic world he had left behind. He took a job as a housekeeper for Mr. Hawkins, a man who had made his fortune in tech. While Ethan's new life was humble, it brought him a sense of tranquility he had longed for. The work was honest, and the pay was enough to cover his expenses. He found satisfaction in the small things. The satisfaction of a clean home, the joy of seeing the garden bloom, the peace that came with the rhythmic sound of cleaning. Mr. Hawkins, on the other hand, was a man of great wealth and influence. He was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that masked a sharp intellect. His mansion, a massive estate that had been passed down through generations, was the symbol of his success. He had made his fortune through innovation in technology, and his business empire spanned across industries. Ethan had always known of Mr. Hawkins, but their relationship was strictly professional. In the years that Ethan had worked for him, they rarely spoke. Mr. Hawkins was a busy man, always on the phone or at meetings, surrounded by a circle of other wealthy individuals. Ethan was simply a fixture in the background, doing his job with the utmost diligence, ensuring the house ran smoothly. He knew his place and never expected anything more from his employer. But on this particular morning, things were different. Ethan had just finished preparing breakfast when he was summoned to Mr. Hawkins' office. Ethan didn't know what to expect. He was used to the occasional request for a simple task, fetching a drink, arranging flowers, or preparing for an event. But when he entered the office, Mr. Hawkins was standing by the window, looking out over the town with a thoughtful expression. He turned when he heard Ethan's footsteps. "Ethan, come in," Mr. Hawkins said in his usual calm voice. "I have a favor to ask." Ethan hesitated but stepped forward. "Of course, Mr. Hawkins. What can I do for you?" Mr. Hawkins motioned to a chair across from him. "I've got an important dinner coming up tonight with some business partners. We're discussing a potential deal, and I'd like you to join me." Ethan blinked in confusion. "Join you, sir? At the dinner?" "Yes," Mr. Hawkins replied, his voice steady. "It'll be a formal business dinner. We're meeting at the Chamberlain, one of the finest restaurants in the city. I'd like you to come with me, Ethan." The invitation was unexpected, to say the least. Ethan had never been to such a high-profile event. He was used to cooking meals for Mr. Hawkins and serving guests, but he had never actually been a part of the conversation. The idea of sitting among influential businessmen and sharing a meal with them was beyond anything he had ever imagined. "I'm not sure, sir. I'm not exactly used to that kind of setting," Ethan stammered. "I wouldn't want to make a scene or anything." Mr. Hawkins smiled, a rare gesture that made him appear more human. "You won't be making a scene, Ethan. I value your insight, and I think you could bring something unique to the table. You've been with me for a while now, and I trust you. Don't worry, just come as you are." Ethan stood there, processing the request. He had never imagined being invited to such an exclusive dinner, let alone as Mr. Hawkins' guest. Part of him wanted to decline, but something inside him pushed him to accept. He had spent so long hiding in the shadows, distancing himself from the world of business he once thrived in. Maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity for redemption, a chance to break free from the life he had chosen and step back into a world that had once felt so familiar. "I'll come, sir," Ethan said, finally deciding to take the leap. "I'll be there." Mr. Hawkins nodded. "Good. I'll have the car ready at 7 p.m. Don't worry about a thing. Just be yourself." With that, Ethan left the office, his mind racing with questions. What would it be like? How would he fit into a world he had long since abandoned? He had no idea, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement. Tonight would change everything. As the day went on, Ethan found himself preparing for the dinner in ways he hadn't expected. He knew he had to look presentable, so he carefully selected the best outfit he had, a crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and a simple tie. It was nothing extravagant, but it was the best he could do with what he had. As the hours ticked by, his nerves began to build. What if he didn't belong? What if he embarrassed himself? The fear of being out of place gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. By the time evening came, Ethan was dressed and ready, but the uncertainty still lingered. He stood by the door, waiting for the car to arrive, staring out at the quiet town below. It felt like the calm before the storm. Tonight would be different. He could feel it in his bones. And as the black car pulled up to the driveway, Ethan took one last look at the mansion before stepping into the unknown. The world he was about to enter was one he hadn't seen in years. It was a world of power, money, and influence, a world that had once been his. And tonight, he would once again find himself in the middle of it all. The dinner was just the beginning. As Ethan stepped into the sleek black car waiting for him outside the mansion, the cool night air seemed to heighten his nerves. The driver, a tall man in a sharp suit, nodded in acknowledgement as Ethan slid into the plush back seat. The vehicle glided smoothly through the quiet streets of Hawthorne, its headlights cutting through the dark like a blade. Ethan's mind raced as he gazed out the window, watching the town slip further away with each passing mile. The quiet town had always been a sanctuary for him, a place to escape the world he had once dominated with his business acumen and high-powered connections. The decision to leave that life behind hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. In the years since, Ethan had found comfort in his role as Mr. Hawkins' housekeeper. It was simple, fulfilling work that kept him grounded. But as he sat there, heading toward the unknown, Ethan felt a strange pull, a magnetic force urging him to return to that life, even if just for one night. The car soon merged onto the highway, leaving the town behind and heading into the heart of the city. Ethan's stomach twisted with anticipation. He had attended formal events before, but this was different. The Chamberlain was no ordinary restaurant, it was an exclusive venue where the city's elite gathered to make deals and solidify power. From the grand chandelier in the lobby to the velvet-lined booths, everything about the place screamed opulence and sophistication. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with apprehension. As they approached the entrance, Ethan's mind began to race. What had Mr. Hawkins seen in him? Why had he invited him to join such an important dinner? Ethan's role had always been clear in Mr. Hawkins' life. He was the caretaker of the mansion, a quiet presence in the background. Yet now, for reasons Ethan didn't fully understand, he was being thrust into the spotlight. The familiar hum of his housekeeper's routine was now replaced by the cacophony of uncertainty and self-doubt. When the car finally pulled up to the restaurant, Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The valet opened the door for him, and he followed the driver up the red carpet to the grand entrance. His eyes widened at the sight of the guests milling about, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they exchanged pleasantries over cocktails. Men in tailored suits and women in glamorous gowns walked with an air of confidence, their every move deliberate, purposeful. Ethan, in contrast, felt like an imposter. He was dressed simply in a dark suit that barely held its own against the wealth surrounding him. His hands clenched nervously, and he could feel the weight of his discomfort in every step. Inside, the restaurant was even more breathtaking. The golden glow of the chandeliers illuminated the marble floors, casting a soft light on the polished wood tables. The hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the air, and the scent of fine food and wine lingered in the atmosphere. Ethan took it all in, but the splendor only made him feel more out of place. The grandiosity of it all seemed to amplify his insecurity. Mr. Hawkins, however, appeared completely at ease. He was already at the center of the room, talking to a group of businessmen, his charisma effortlessly drawing people in. Ethan felt a brief pang of envy as he watched Mr. Hawkins navigate the world he had once been a part of so easily. But instead of being overwhelmed, Mr. Hawkins gave Ethan a reassuring smile when their eyes met across the room, and he gestured for him to join. "Ethan! Over here," Mr. Hawkins called, his voice carrying easily over the noise. Ethan, somewhat startled, quickly made his way toward him. As he approached, Mr. Hawkins' colleagues, a group of well-dressed men and women, turned to assess him. Their eyes briefly flicked over him, sizing him up, but they quickly returned to their conversation. "Gentlemen, this is Ethan," Mr. Hawkins introduced him. "He's been with me for quite some time now, helping with various matters around the house. Ethan, these are my business associates. You've probably heard of some of them." The introductions were a blur of names and handshakes, but Ethan did his best to appear composed. One man, a tall, sharp-faced investor with a cold, calculating look in his eyes, extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. Mr. Hawkins speaks very highly of you." The man's grip was firm, almost too firm, as though he were trying to gauge Ethan's worth with the mere touch of his hand. Ethan nodded politely but didn't say much. His mind was too occupied by the surreal nature of it all. As the evening unfolded, Ethan found himself struggling to blend in. The conversations around him revolved around deals, mergers, and investments. The topics were far beyond his comprehension, and though he tried to listen attentively, he couldn't help but feel completely lost in the sea of jargon. He sipped his water quietly, nodding when appropriate, but mostly kept to himself. Mr. Hawkins was the life of the party, engaging with his colleagues in a way that Ethan could never have managed. The way he commanded attention, how effortlessly he moved through the room, was a sharp contrast to Ethan's awkwardness. Throughout the evening, Ethan noticed subtle glances exchanged between the guests. Some were inquisitive, some dismissive, but there was always an undercurrent of judgment. He wasn't sure if they were simply curious about him as an outsider or if they were questioning why someone like Mr. Hawkins would bring a lowly housekeeper into such an exclusive environment. Ethan could sense that the power dynamics were shifting, and he was caught in the middle of it all. At one point, the conversation turned to business, a new venture that Mr. Hawkins was considering. The group of businessmen debated the potential risks and rewards of the project, but the conversation became increasingly intense. Ethan listened quietly, unsure of how to participate. Then, as if on instinct, one of the men, an older investor with a gruff voice, turned to him. "So, Ethan, what do you think of the proposal?" Ethan froze. All eyes were on him. The entire table had suddenly turned their attention to him, as if expecting him to say something profound. His heart raced in his chest. The words felt stuck in his throat. He had no idea what to say, but then, for some reason, a memory from his past flashed through his mind. He remembered a similar deal he had once been involved in, one that had gone terribly wrong. Without thinking, he opened his mouth. "You know," Ethan began, his voice sounding surprisingly steady despite the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him, "there's always risk in these things, but sometimes it's about balancing the long-term rewards with the short-term costs. A deal like this requires trust, but it also requires transparency. If you're not upfront about the challenges, it can all come crashing down when you least expect it." The table fell silent. The older investor blinked at him, clearly taken aback by the response. The others exchanged surprised glances. Mr. Hawkins raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Ethan, too, was surprised by what he had just said. He hadn't intended to make such a bold statement, but somehow, it had come out of him. For a brief moment, the conversation shifted, and the focus was no longer on the deal but on Ethan himself. The businessmen began to ask him more questions, probing deeper into his past. They were curious, not just about his knowledge, but about how someone like him, someone they had assumed was just a housekeeper, could have such insight into the business world. Ethan, though still feeling out of place, began to answer with more confidence. The more he spoke, the more he realized how much he had forgotten about the world he had left behind. The strategies, the negotiations, the deals, it all started to come back to him, not as a distant memory, but as something he had once mastered. But even as he spoke, a lingering sense of unease remained. The reality of the situation was still hard to accept. He was no longer the sharp young executive he had once been. He was a man who had retreated from that world, choosing a simpler life. But here, at this table, surrounded by men who could have once been his competitors, he felt the pull of the world he had walked away from. The night was far from over, and though Ethan had managed to find his voice, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something much larger than he could have imagined. The dinner was just the beginning, but what lay ahead was unknown. The choices he made tonight would have cast the evening wore on, the atmosphere at the table grew more relaxed. The initial tension that had surrounded Ethan began to dissipate, replaced by a curiosity from the other guests. Mr. Hawkins, though still at the center of the group, now looked at Ethan with a quiet approval, as if this moment was part of a plan he had long been executing. Ethan, still feeling like an outsider, could sense the subtle shift in the group's energy. They were no longer looking at him with pity or confusion. There was a new interest in their eyes, a respect that had been earned, albeit in a way that Ethan had never expected. The conversation continued to flow easily, with each guest contributing their own thoughts on the potential business venture. But now, whenever Ethan spoke, the table grew silent for a moment, each person listening intently. The older investor who had initially challenged him, a man named Gregory Dunn, seemed especially intrigued. He had leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his steely gray eyes fixed on Ethan. "You know, Ethan, you've got a sharp way of thinking." "I wasn't expecting that," Gregory said, his voice low but appreciative. "Where did you get your business acumen?" Ethan felt a surge of pride, but quickly pushed it down. He had always been modest about his past, especially since he had walked away from that world. He wasn't sure how much to reveal, how much of the truth he should share with these men, but the moment seemed to demand an answer. "I used to be in finance," Ethan replied, his voice calm but steady. "I worked for a large firm in the city. Made my way up, did a lot of deals, but after a while, I started to realize that it wasn't the life I wanted anymore. It wasn't worth the cost." Gregory nodded slowly, as if he had heard that kind of story before. A lot of people think they want that lifestyle, but it's easy to get consumed by it. "So, what changed for you?" Ethan paused for a moment, thinking back to those days when his career had seemed like everything. It wasn't a single moment, but more like a series of little realizations. You lose yourself along the way. I wanted peace, something real. So I walked away from all of it. Moved to Hawthorne and started a new chapter. Now I just take care of things around the house for Mr. Hawkins. It's simpler. The room fell into a reflective silence as the guests absorbed his words. Mr. Hawkins, who had been listening intently, gave a small smile, his eyes twinkling with a hidden meaning. It was as though this was precisely what he had hoped for. Ethan's past was coming to light. But without the bitterness or regret that often accompanied such stories. Instead, Ethan spoke with a quiet dignity, as if the choices he had made were part of a larger plan he hadn't yet fully understood. The conversation shifted, but the tone had changed. Ethan found himself being drawn into discussions of strategy, risk management, and even global markets. He had always been an analytical thinker, and despite his years away from the corporate world, the old instincts kicked in. He wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. He was a participant in this conversation, offering insights and even challenging some of the assumptions the group had made. Mr. Hawkins was careful not to overemphasize Ethan's involvement, but the look of approval in his eyes was unmistakable. As the night progressed, the food was served in elaborate courses, each one more exquisite than the last. The flavors were rich, the presentation flawless, but for Ethan, it was the people around the table that held his attention. He had forgotten how exhilarating it could be to be part of a discussion that shaped the future, how invigorating it was to feel that spark of intellectual engagement. For a moment, it felt as though he had never left that world at all. Then came the unexpected twist. As dessert was being cleared away, the group started to discuss the final details of the deal. Mr. Hawkins had been holding back, allowing the others to speak their piece, but now it was his turn. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone, and everyone at the table fell silent. "Gentlemen, I've been thinking a lot about this proposal," Mr. Hawkins began, his words measured. "It's a great opportunity, but there's one thing I think we need to consider more carefully: ethics. I'm not just talking about the financial implications, but the larger impact this could have on our community. We all know how much power we wield, but with power comes responsibility. We need to think about the long-term consequences of our actions, not just the immediate gains." Ethan looked up sharply, his curiosity piqued. He had never heard Mr. Hawkins speak so openly about ethics. The men around the table shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to such a candid approach to business. But Ethan knew that Mr. Hawkins was right. In the world of high-stakes deals, ethical considerations often took a back seat to profit. But here, in this moment, it felt as though everything was being re-evaluated. Gregory Dunn, the same investor who had been so skeptical of Ethan earlier, frowned. "We can't afford to make decisions based on feelings, Vincent. This is business. It's about results, not moral compasses." Mr. Hawkins smiled but didn't back down. "I disagree. Business can't exist in a vacuum. It affects people. It shapes the world. And I, for one, don't want to be responsible for something that might damage the very foundation of our society." Ethan watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It wasn't that he hadn't heard such arguments before, but the way Mr. Hawkins presented them, calmly, confidently, without any hint of moral superiority, struck a chord within him. It was as if the man had become a bridge between two worlds, the cutthroat, results-driven world of business, and the quiet, ethical world Ethan had chosen for himself. The conversation grew heated, but it was clear that Mr. Hawkins had the upper hand. By the end of the evening, a surprising consensus had been reached. The deal would move forward, but with new parameters in place, ones that considered not just the financial rewards, but the broader societal impact. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had played a small part in this conversation, and it had made a difference. It wasn't just the business strategies that mattered, it was the people involved, the choices they made, and the values they chose to uphold. As the dinner came to a close, Mr. Hawkins stood and excused himself, shaking hands with his associates. Ethan, still processing everything that had transpired, stood up to follow. As he walked toward the door, Gregory Dunn stopped him. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ethan," Gregory said, his tone surprisingly warm. "I didn't think I'd say this, but you might just have a future in this business, if you wanted it." Ethan smiled, unsure of how to respond. It was a compliment, but it was also a challenge, one that came with a weight he hadn't expected. Was this the beginning of something more? Was he ready to re-enter the world he had left behind, with all its risks and rewards? When they stepped out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit Ethan's face, grounding him. The city was alive with lights, bustling with energy, but it felt different now. He was no longer just an observer. He had stepped back into the world of business, in a way that was unexpected, but undeniably powerful. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: things had changed. And he was ready for whatever came next. As the car drove him back to the mansion, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the night's events. It had started as a simple dinner, a request from his employer, but it had turned into something far more transformative. The choices he made that night would echo through his life, leading him down paths he hadn't yet imagined. What would he do next? Would he return to his quiet life, or would he take the risk, step into the unknown, and see where it led? As the lights of the city faded in the distance, one thing was clear: Ethan's life was about to take a turn, and it was up to him to decide which direction he would go. The days following the dinner felt like a whirlwind for Ethan. The quiet, humble routine he had grown so accustomed to in Hawthorne now seemed like a distant memory. As he walked through the mansion's expansive halls, the weight of the events at the Chamberlain settled heavily on his shoulders. The conversation with Gregory Dunn had stuck with him. The older investor's words echoed in his mind: "You might just have a future in this business." It had been a casual comment, but it felt more like a challenge Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Could he really return to the world of high finance? After years of living a life focused on simplicity, could he handle the pressure, the decisions, and the moral compromises that came with such a life? Or had he found something more meaningful in the quiet moments of his current existence, those moments spent taking care of the mansion, learning the rhythms of a different world, one that was far removed from boardrooms and stock markets? The question lingered in his mind as he sat at his desk in the study, staring out the window at the sprawling grounds that stretched out before him. He had spent the past few days trying to return to his normal routine, but it was difficult. Every time he tried to focus on the tasks at hand, his thoughts would drift back to the dinner, back to the discussions, back to the possibilities that had suddenly reappeared in his life. There was a part of him that longed for the excitement of those high-powered deals, the thrill of closing a deal that would change everything. But there was also the part of him that knew the price for such excitement. Was it worth the personal sacrifices? Was it worth the toll it would take on his peace of mind? Mr. Hawkins had noticed the change in him. Over the next few days, he had asked Ethan several times how he was feeling, if he was adjusting back to his routine. Ethan had always been honest with him, and he found himself sharing more than he ever had before. For the first time, he confided in Mr. Hawkins about his internal struggle, the pull between the life he had left behind and the life he had built for himself here. "Mr. Hawkins, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at that dinner," Ethan had said one evening, as they stood together in the garden, overlooking the sprawling estate. The conversation felt more like a confession, one he hadn't fully prepared for. "I don't know if I'm ready to go back to that world. I thought I had left it behind for good." Mr. Hawkins had listened in silence, his gaze steady and focused. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was clear that every sentence was carefully chosen. "You don't have to make any decisions right now, Ethan," he had said softly. "The world you left behind is still there, and it will be waiting for you when and if you decide to go back." It was during this walk that he had the first moment of clarity. He stopped at the old oak tree by the edge of the garden, a tree that had been there for as long as he could remember. It was massive, its branches twisting and reaching toward the sky like the arms of a giant. He had spent countless hours under that tree in the years since he had come to Hawthorne, sitting with a book or simply letting his mind wander. As he gazed up at the branches, something inside him clicked. The decision didn't have to be all or nothing. He didn't have to return to the world of business, but he also didn't have to abandon the skills and knowledge he had gained. There was a middle ground, a path that would allow him to use what he had learned without sacrificing the peace he had found. The key, he realized, was balance. By the time he returned to the mansion, he had made up his mind. He would not jump headfirst back into the world of high-powered deals and ruthless negotiations, but neither would he turn his back on it completely. He would find a way to merge the two worlds, the one he had left behind and the one he had embraced. Ethan didn't need to make a name for himself in the boardrooms of the world again. What mattered was making a difference in a way that felt true to who he was. And so, with a newfound sense of purpose, he sat down at his desk and began to write a plan that would use his expertise, but in a way that was aligned with his values. He would work on projects that had a positive impact on his community. He would leverage the knowledge he had gained to guide smaller businesses, to help them navigate the complexities of the corporate world without losing sight of the things that truly mattered: ethics, transparency, and integrity. It wasn't about returning to the world he had once known, it was about bringing the best parts of that world into something that had a deeper purpose. It wasn't an easy road. Ethan knew that. The temptation to return to the old ways, to chase after the allure of money and power, would always be there. But he was no longer driven by those things. His time at the Chamberlain had reminded him of the skills he had, but it had also reminded him of the cost of living in a world where those skills were used solely for personal gain. In the days that followed, he shared his decision with Mr. Hawkins. As always, his employer had been supportive, offering advice and encouragement. But it was clear that Mr. Hawkins had always seen potential in Ethan. He knew that Ethan was capable of much more than simply caring for a mansion. Ethan began to seek out opportunities to help local businesses, offering advice on strategy, risk management, and even ethical practices. He worked closely with entrepreneurs who shared his values, helping them grow their businesses in ways that were sustainable and responsible. His reputation slowly grew, not as a businessman seeking to climb the corporate ladder, but as someone who helped others achieve success on their own terms. Despite his efforts to keep things small and local, the ripple effects of his work began to spread. He found himself being invited to more high-profile dinners, meetings with influential people, and speaking engagements. But Ethan didn't want to play the game by the rules that everyone else followed. He was carving his own path, one that was grounded in his beliefs, one that didn't require him to sacrifice his peace of mind for success. The more Ethan embraced this path, the more he realized that he had indeed found a new life, a life that combined the lessons of his past with the values he had learned along the way. And though he didn't know exactly where it would take him, he felt certain of one thing: the future was his to create, and he would do so on his own terms. But as the years went by, something unexpected happened. Ethan's reputation grew, and with it, his influence. Slowly, the same businessmen who had once viewed him as nothing more than a housekeeper began to respect him not only for his expertise but for his unwavering integrity. It wasn't long before he found himself sitting at the table once again, this time not as an outsider, but as a trusted advisor, someone who had built a new kind of success, one that didn't rely on cutthroat tactics but on genuine, ethical leadership. In the end, Ethan realized that the dinner at the Chamberlain had been a turning point, not just in his career but in his life. It had sparked a transformation in him, but it was a transformation that had always been within him, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And as he looked back on that night, he understood as the months passed, Ethan's life continued to evolve in ways he had never imagined. The balance he had sought between the two worlds, the corporate and the peaceful, the high stakes and the grounded, had slowly become not just a reality, but his new way of life. He had worked hard to ensure that his new path wasn't a temporary detour, but a lasting transformation. And though his daily routines remained grounded in the simple life he had built in Hawthorne, the work he did for local businesses, his growing influence, and the reputation he had developed slowly began to blur the lines between his old life and the one he had chosen. Every time Ethan walked through the grand halls of Mr. Hawkins' mansion, he couldn't help but marvel at how far he had come. It was almost surreal to think that just a year ago, he had been a man adrift, caught between the past and the present. Now, he was someone people turned to for guidance, someone who had found a unique place in a world that had once felt like it was beyond him. But this newfound success didn't come without its own set of challenges that would test his resolve and force him to confront parts of himself he had long avoided. One particularly cold morning, as Ethan sat in the study, reviewing a proposal from a local startup, he received a call from Gregory Dunn. He hadn't heard from the investor in months, and while the call wasn't entirely unexpected, Ethan couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Gregory was one of those men who only reached out when he wanted something, when he thought it would benefit him. But despite his reservations, Ethan answered. That sometimes, the unexpected twists of life lead to the most fulfilling journeys. Ethan, good to hear from you. How's the quiet life treating you? Gregory's voice on the other end was as sharp and direct as always, but there was an underlying urgency to it that piqued Ethan's curiosity. Everything's good. A little busier than usual, but I'm managing. What's going on, Gregory? Ethan asked, trying to read between the lines of the conversation. I'll get straight to the point, Gregory replied, his tone shifting. There's a project I'm involved with, something big. And I need someone like you. Someone who knows the ropes but also has a different perspective. I'm putting together a team for a new venture, and I'd like you to be a part of it. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The offer was unexpected. Gregory Dunn, a man who had once been dismissive of him, was now asking him to join a high-level project. Ethan felt the familiar temptation rising within him, the allure of prestige, of success, of power. This was the world he had once thrived in, and though he had walked away from it, it was still there, waiting for him. The decision wasn't as easy as it had been a year ago when he had walked away for the first time. Let me think about it, Ethan replied, trying to keep his emotions in check. I'm not sure if this is the right move for me. There was a pause on the other end, and then Gregory spoke again, his voice quieter, almost coaxing. I get it, Ethan. I really do. But you need to understand that this isn't just any project. It's going to change everything. I know you're doing great work in the community, but this is something that could really make an impact. The kind of impact that could reshape the way people think about business and responsibility. And I know you're the kind of person who doesn't just chase after profit for the sake of it. The words hung in the air between them, and Ethan could feel the weight of them. It was tempting. But the deeper he listened to Gregory's pitch, the more he realized that the pull of returning to that world wasn't just about the opportunity, it was about the validation, the recognition, the respect that came with being part of something large, something influential. He put the phone down and sat in silence, reflecting on the offer. Was this the right move? He had worked so hard to build a life where his work mattered, not for the money or the accolades, but for the difference it made. Was he willing to risk all of that for another shot at the high life? Ethan thought about Mr. Hawkins, his quiet wisdom, and the peace he had found in this new life. But he also thought about the people he had helped, the small businesses that had flourished because of his guidance. That had been rewarding in ways he hadn't anticipated. But was it enough? Later that afternoon, Ethan made his decision. He called Gregory back. "I've thought it over," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I'm going to pass on this one." "I understand," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "But I've got my priorities straight. And they're not about building empires. They're about making real, meaningful change. That's what matters to me." As he hung up the phone, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Turning down that offer wasn't easy, it never would be. But it felt right. He wasn't rejecting the opportunity because he was afraid of it. He was rejecting it because he had come to realize that success meant something different to him now. In the following weeks, Ethan's work with local businesses expanded. He began to speak at more conferences, offering his insights on ethical business practices and sustainable growth. He worked with organizations focused on social impact, helping them balance profit with purpose. People began to recognize his unique approach to business, a man who had climbed to the top only to step away and create something more meaningful. And slowly, Ethan realized that the success he had once craved in boardrooms and high-rise offices was no longer his definition of success. But just as things seemed to settle, the world had a way of reminding Ethan that change was constant. One day, as he was wrapping up a meeting with a new client, he received a call from Mr. Hawkins. There was something urgent in his voice, something that immediately set Ethan on edge. "Ethan, I need to see you," Mr. Hawkins said. "There's been a development I think you need to be aware of." Ethan's heart raced as he drove to the mansion. What could it be? Was it about the community projects he had been working on? Or had there been a change in Hawkins' own business dealings? As he entered the mansion and made his way to the study, Mr. Hawkins was waiting for him, looking more serious than Ethan had ever seen him. "We've been hearing some troubling things," Mr. Hawkins began, as he gestured for Ethan to sit. "There's a corporate takeover happening in the city, something big. And your name has come up. People in the higher circles are starting to talk about you." Ethan frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What are they saying?" "They're saying you're the one to lead it," Mr. Hawkins replied, his voice calm, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something unreadable. "They think you've got what it takes to spearhead this venture. It's exactly the kind of project you'd thrive in. But there's a catch: if you accept it, you'll be drawn into a game that you might not be ready to play." The words sank into Ethan like a stone. He had just made peace with his decision to stay grounded, to focus on the work that mattered to him. But now, this offer, a far-reaching, high-stakes project, had been thrust in front of him. It felt like a test, a crossroads. The decision wasn't just about business anymore. It was about who he had become. As he stared at Mr. Hawkins, Ethan knew Ethan spent the next several days consumed by doubt, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He knew that the world he had walked away from was once again knocking at his door. The offer, with all its promises of power, influence, and wealth, was a reminder of everything he had left behind, a life that had once defined his worth. Yet, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Hadn't he already made a decision? Hadn't he already found a sense of purpose that felt truer to who he was than any business deal could ever provide? Mr. Hawkins' warning echoed in his mind, a subtle but constant reminder that he couldn't step back into this world without facing consequences. What if accepting this offer meant compromising everything he had worked for? What if the pressure and the demands of this new venture would slowly erode the peace and balance he had fought so hard to establish? And yet, the other part of him, the ambitious, driven part, found the idea irresistible. This was his chance to make an impact on a much larger scale, to leave a legacy that would be talked about for generations. Was that not the kind of success he had once longed for? Days stretched into restless nights as Ethan wrestled with himself, pacing the halls of the mansion, reflecting on every aspect of his journey. He thought of the people whose lives had been transformed by his guidance, small business owners who now felt empowered to run their companies with a sense of purpose, entrepreneurs who had learned how to balance ambition with integrity. He thought of the community he had built, and the contentment he had found in it. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the limit of what he could accomplish? Had he reached the peak of his potential, or was there more waiting for him beyond the horizon? One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself at the old oak tree once again, the tree that had witnessed the many turning points in his life. The cold night air brushed against his skin, sharp and invigorating. As he stood there, staring up at the massive branches, he tried to quiet the noise in his head. For the first time in days, he closed his eyes and let the silence envelop him. This moment would define the rest of his life. Ethan spent the next several days consumed by doubt, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He knew that the world he had walked away from was once again knocking at his door. The offer, with all its promises of power, influence, and wealth, was a reminder of everything he had left behind, a life that had once defined his worth. Yet, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Hadn't he already made a decision? Hadn't he already found a sense of purpose that felt truer to who he was than any business deal could ever provide? Mr. Hawkins' warning echoed in his mind, a subtle but constant reminder that he couldn't step back into this world without facing consequences. What if accepting this offer meant compromising everything he had worked for? What if the pressure and the demands of this new venture would slowly erode the peace and balance he had fought so hard to establish? And yet, the other part of him, the ambitious, driven part, found the idea irresistible. This was his chance to make an impact on a much larger scale, to leave a legacy that would be talked about for generations. Was that not the kind of success he had once longed for? Days stretched into restless nights as Ethan wrestled with himself, pacing the halls of the mansion, reflecting on every aspect of his journey. He thought of the people whose lives had been transformed by his guidance, small business owners who now felt empowered to run their companies with a sense of purpose, entrepreneurs who had learned how to balance ambition with integrity. He thought of the community he had built, and the contentment he had found in it. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the limit of what he could accomplish? Had he reached the peak of his potential, or was there more waiting for him beyond the horizon? One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself at the old oak tree once again, the tree that had witnessed the many turning points in his life. The cold night air brushed against his skin, sharp and invigorating. As he stood there, staring up at the massive branches, he tried to quiet the noise in his head. For the first time in days, he closed his eyes and let the silence envelop him. And in that stillness, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't clarity, not yet, but it was a sense of calm. The decision didn't have to be immediate. He didn't have to rush into anything. For once, he realized that he didn't need to choose between the two worlds. He didn't need to define himself by either one. He could chart his own course, on his own terms, without being bound by the expectations of others. The next morning, Ethan met with Mr. Hawkins to discuss the matter further. He had made his decision, but it wasn't one he could make lightly. He needed to hear the advice of someone he trusted deeply. As they sat across from each other in the study, Ethan's words were measured, deliberate. "Mr. Hawkins," Ethan began, his voice steady, "I've been thinking about what you said. And I've been thinking about everything that's led me to this point. I've realized that I don't have to abandon my values to succeed. And I don't have to be defined by the corporate world, or by anything else, for that matter. I've found something worth holding on to here. And I think it's time to create something new, something that combines everything I've learned from both worlds." Mr. Hawkins listened intently, his expression thoughtful, but not surprised. He had always known that Ethan was capable of more than he had let on. The man sitting before him was no longer the same person who had walked into the mansion months ago. Ethan had grown, and Mr. Hawkins could see it in his eyes. You're right, Mr. Hawkins replied after a long pause. You don't have to follow the same path as everyone else. You've already forged your own. And I think that's where your true strength lies. But whatever you decide, just make sure it's something that feels true to you. With that, Ethan knew he had the green light to pursue a path that was entirely his own. It wasn't about fitting into a mold. It wasn't about pleasing anyone or following a script. It was about creating something that was authentic to who he had become, a blend of the lessons he had learned from both the corporate world and the quieter, more purposeful life he had built in Hawthorne. Ethan spent the following weeks quietly working behind the scenes, reaching out to trusted contacts, and formulating a plan that would combine the best of both worlds. He wouldn't be taking on a corporate venture for the sake of power and prestige. Instead, he would help businesses grow, not just in financial terms, but in ways that had a lasting impact on their communities and the world at large. He would work with entrepreneurs who shared his vision of ethical, sustainable success, and help them achieve their goals without sacrificing their values. But Ethan wasn't just interested in helping businesses. He wanted to build something more, a platform, a movement that would challenge the way people viewed success. He envisioned a network of entrepreneurs, business owners, and innovators who worked together to create positive change, who recognized that success wasn't just about the bottom line, but about making a difference in the world. He didn't want to change the game, he wanted to redefine it. In the coming months, his vision began to take shape. He launched a series of workshops and seminars focused on ethical business practices, offering mentorship and guidance to young entrepreneurs who were just starting out. He built partnerships with organizations that focused on social impact and sustainability, and he used his platform to advocate for a new kind of business culture, one that valued people and the planet as much as profits. Word of Ethan's work spread, and soon, he was invited to speak at conferences and forums where leaders in the business world gathered to discuss the future of the industry. But he wasn't there to offer the usual advice. He wasn't there to talk about increasing profit margins or gaining market share. He was there to talk about creating businesses that made a real difference, not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of the legacy they left behind. One evening, after a particularly powerful speech at a national business conference, Ethan found himself standing on the balcony of the hotel where the event was being held. He was tired, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the air, the kind that came only after knowing you had spoken your truth to an audience that had been eager to hear it. As he looked out over the city below, the weight of the decision he had made months ago felt lighter. This was the path he had chosen, and though it hadn't always been easy, it was the one that had brought him peace. And then, as he turned to head back inside, he saw a familiar face, Gregory Dunn, standing at the edge of the balcony, staring out over the city as well. Gregory's presence was no surprise, he was always at the forefront of the events, always chasing after the next big thing. But as Ethan walked over to him, there was a shift in their dynamic. Gregory looked at him, his expression inscrutable. "I didn't expect to see you here, Ethan," Gregory said, his tone as direct as ever. "I didn't expect to be here," Ethan replied with a small smile. "But things have a way of working out, don't they?" Gregory nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were sizing Ethan up. "You've changed. I'll give you that. I've been hearing about your work, about what you're building. You're making waves, and people are starting to take notice." Ethan shrugged, not wanting to boast. "I'm just doing what I believe is right." Gregory laughed, but there was something almost admiring in his tone. "That's the thing with people like you, Ethan. You always think about what's right. You never just go for what's easy or what's expected. It's why you've succeeded in a way most people never will." There was a long pause before Gregory spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe there's more to success than just closing deals, making money, and building empires. You're onto something, Ethan. And maybe I'm starting to see it now." Ethan studied Gregory for a moment. This wasn't the same man he had met months ago, the man who had seen him as little more than a housekeeper. There was a shift in him, too, a recognition that success might be about something more than wealth and power. Maybe, Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. But you have to be willing to redefine what success means. And sometimes, that means walking away from the things you think you want. Gregory didn't respond immediately. He just stared out at the city, as if considering Ethan's words. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel the need to convince him. He didn't need to prove anything to Gregory, or to anyone else. The work he was doing spoke for itself. As he walked back inside, Ethan felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything money or power could offer. He had found his place in the world, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew he was on the right path. The path he had carved for himself, on his own terms.